Hi, thanks, Ian. Hi, Zain. Thanks so much for the introduction. I'm so glad to have Zain Rizvi here. I'm going to just share my slides to kick off this session. We're going to be having a little chat, and we're going to spend some time doing some breakout rooms to get to discuss this topic a little bit. So yeah, we're going to be talking about combating the hero myth with collective action. Why is it so important that we sort of act as a collective? And I think we've heard a lot of great reasons over the past 2 days. But Zain, would you like to introduce yourself and kick us off with some initial overview thoughts?
Sure, thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. My name is Zain Rizvi. I am a law and policy researcher at Public Citizen. Public Citizen, for those who don't know, is a consumer advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. We work on all kinds of issues, democracy reform, the environment, and also healthcare. And so I have been working closely with Liz and many others on this call on insulin access issues, US drug pricing at large, and then, of course, global access to medicines issues. So I thought I'd start by framing things by really understanding, what this is about in a sense, right? I think a lot of us understand kind of the policy stakes, right? The kind of personal stakes as well for many of us when it comes to accessing medicines. But I think it's also extremely helpful to understand the pharmaceutical industry. And some of this is well known, but let's just state the facts, right? Let's be clear-eyed about what the facts are. The facts are that the pharmaceutical industry is one of the most powerful industries in the world, right? The pharmaceutical industry spends more money lobbying than pretty much anyone else. The pharmaceutical industry, here's a crazy stat I found. From 1999 to 2018, pharma and health products spent $4.7 billion on lobbying and campaign contributions. This is just within the US, right? This is not even talking about kind of the reach of the pharmaceutical industry around the world. And we know it's there, right? We know this, we know it's there. In the US, for every member of Congress, there are 2 lobbyists registered for the pharmaceutical industry. So your political officials are outnumbered 2 to 1. And yet, even as we know this, and I should also emphasize for a lot of the folks who are working at the state level, this is also true at the state level, right? Like I don't have the particular stats, but you can imagine there is an enormous pull exerted by the pharmaceutical industry, even at the state level. Every time a state kind of tries to do something on drug pricing, you can imagine kind of, pharma's vans pulling up near the state legislator. So I wanted to state that just to kind of make sure we understand the scope, of really what some of the challenge is, and not to say it in a sense that's kind of dispiriting or depressing or makes us overwhelmed, but to recognize that even despite these facts, even despite the power exerted by the pharmaceutical industry, there have been remarkable victories, right? We have seen remarkable victories over the past 30 years when it comes to many pharmaceutical issues. So you think about kind of the AIDS activism that I'm sure other folks have talked about in the late 80s or the 90s, whether you talk about kind of some of the global work that went on in the 2000s, early 2000s to make HIV medicines affordable all around the world. And so we know that we can win. And then the question is, so how do we win, right? And there's no, I wish I had a kind of secret sauce to tell you all, but I think part of it, I think the answer is kind of obvious. And the answer is social movements, right? If you think about in history, how has power been challenged? How has the world become more just? How has, how have we made progress? And the answer in large part lies in the power of social movements. When you think about people banding together to fight for what is right, it is simply people power. And I think, and this is where it gets complicated, is that even as we know this is true, we know the enormous power of people, but social movements, you all are part of one. You understand now, as either veterans or newcomers to the social movement world, that things are complicated. Things can get messy, and there are many reasons for that. And so the discussion today, hopefully, really talks about one element of social movements, which is around the kind of hero myth and the need for collective action, really, and not just individual exemplary accomplishments. I think it's worth acknowledging that social movements are messy for lots of reasons. And one of the reasons, particularly in many patient advocacy communities, is because people have a lot of trauma, right? Things are hard. Things are very hard, and our own lives are very hard. And sometimes we displace the frustration that we feel with the status quo, with the pharmaceutical industry, with things that are wrong, onto others that are working with us. There are many reasons for this, right? That's one of them. And sometimes it can be, smaller things, it can be simpler things. But the question is, how do we move beyond that? How do we move forward? And of course, this is a 5-minute framing thing I'm doing, and we're gonna have 30 minutes or so after for discussion. So we can't solve it all, but I'm hoping at least that the session will ask enough questions to get us really thinking about some of these bigger questions. Because I think, at the end of the day, one of the remarkable things about the work that we're doing is that it's actually very, very popular. If you actually ask folks, should people, should the price of insulin be like $300 a vial in the US? That's not popular, right? No, most ordinary people are not kind of championing $300 insulin, right? Most people do want, for example, Medicare to negotiate prices. Actually, 90% of Americans agree on that. And globally too, you see similar things where people really do want common sense solutions. And so the big challenge in front of us is, how do we mobilize the kind of vast majority of people who are with us, who are behind these policies, to really join the movement? So how do you build the kind of movement that invites others to join? I heard this amazing activist speak once, and I'm forgetting exactly who she was referring to, but there was this one thing she said, which was, among the woke, how do we keep space for the people who are still awakening? And so with that framing, I'll kind of give it to Liz to lead some of the questions, and I hope we can have a really rich discussion.
Thank you so much, Zain. I think so many good points just in that framing. And I think the point that these movements are messy, and that there are a lot of emotions, and emotions run high because, again, we are living with and dealing with our own challenges. And I think I was reading something the other day that some of the best leaders are able to sort of hold those emotions, and that can help us get through these movements. And I know so many of our leaders do that so well. So just another quick question as we go into the next section here, a little framing. If you could type in the chat, those of you who are here, what are some of the things that you didn't expect to see or experience when you joined the Insulin for All movement and T1 International, and what was a surprise to you about this cause or movement? So just anything that kind of wasn't maybe what you expected, kind of getting to that sort of messiness maybe, but it could be something great, or it could be something challenging. We'd just love to hear your responses in the chat. So I'll pause for a moment and then share a little bit more before we jump into our breakout rooms. Across the globe, despite country variances. Wasn't quite prepared for how traumatizing it can be to constantly share our own stories. How those that you're advocating for can be angry at you when things do not turn out the way they expected. Yeah, so there's a lot just in those responses of things that sort of make this work really, really difficult. Coming from a privileged country health-wise, the scope of the problem experienced firsthand by others, how pharma ties are so interwoven within patient advocacy works. Yeah, so much. Feel free to keep riffing. I'm gonna press on because that's really helpful, I think, in the framing of this as we move forward into our breakout rooms. And I just wanted to share a little bit more. That's me, you all know me, about what is the hero myth, since that's kind of the context we're talking about here. Again, we've heard from so many speakers about, and groups of speakers, panelists, about coming together and why coming together is so important. And that's kind of what a movement is a lot of people coming together for a cause. So just when we talk about the hero myth, I'm sure if you can think of your favorite movie or your favorite TV show or your favorite book, whatever that might be, not just actual superhero films, but any kind of story tends to follow this sort of arc of the hero myth. It's been a tool for kind of young people to learn their role as they mature. This circle here kind of gives an overview of what that journey is, where there's often some sort of challenge or barrier, and there's, you know, struggles, and maybe something kind of miraculous happens, or this person finds something super strength or amazing and then saves the day. And that's a really, really abbreviated version of this hero myth cycle. But again, we sort of, I think many of us grow up seeing and hearing that, particularly in the media. This is just so prevalent, of one key core hero that comes and saves the day. And it truly is, I think, once you start to kind of see this cycle and this pattern, you really do see it everywhere, as I say, particularly in mass media, which is what we are inundated with day in and day out, is the story of one person saving the day. And it does truly center a savior. And it can be problematic because it just kind of takes our power away, because either we're waiting for that savior or we think we are that savior. And as Zain said in his remarks, you know, change throughout history has been through movements and through people coming together. We've seen the only reason that things change is because of the collective. There are faces that and names that we know that come up again and again, but actually those were, you know, maybe the spokesperson, but there was so much going on behind the scenes, which we heard a little bit about in the last session. You know, the planners, the people that are actually unseen and often forgotten in the history books. It took a village, it took a whole community to make these changes. And I think it's just so important to kind of notice when that hero myth is playing out, and that it's often, you know, from a very patriarchal lens as well. Often it's a male there at the front. And so there's a lot of privilege points that come with that too. So that's just a little bit about what the hero myth is, and kind of why maybe we want to break that, to bust that myth a little bit, because we are, of course, we have power within ourselves, and we want to feel like we have agency in our world. And I don't think that there's an issue with that, but we do kind of want to try to focus and find these alternative narratives that show people coming together, a wide range of people, not a homogenous group of people, but a diverse group of people coming together to really change a situation, rather than, you know, people kind of going off and doing their own thing and hoping that they can change something. As this little image shows, we're so much more powerful when we come together and bring our power into something that's going to take on the big problem of big pharma, which Zain just talked about. We really, in order to make that kind of systemic change, it's going to take more and more people power, and it's the only thing that's made change throughout history. So this is a very, very brief overview of the hero myth, but again, you'll start to see it if you haven't sort of read about it or heard about it before. And if you want a couple suggestions, it's hard to find a lot of great media that is about the collective and the community, but I can suggest some of those to you later if you want ideas. So now we're going to give you a chance to chat a little bit and think a little bit about this. So we're going to go into breakout rooms and think about this question here. How do we build on the existing movement in a way that focuses on collective rather than individual? And how do we go beyond individual heroes? So we'll be popping into those rooms, and then we'll come back and share out a little bit. Hello, welcome back. Give folks 1-2 seconds to rejoin. Did I fail to say that? I think I said we'll be feeding back, but I don't know if you all nominated a person to do that from each group. So whoever was in a group and would like to hop in and share some of the themes from your conversation, we would love to hear it. And you can either type something in the chat, or ideally, if you want to just raise your hand, then Monique will unmute you. Pramita has her hand raised, and then Stephanie next.
Yeah, thank you so much. You know, we were discussing this really important issue, and suddenly, like, you know, the time was up, but I'd like to bring this forward. So, you know, we guys were discussing about this new trend about, you know, the sponsorships being given by the diabetes technology companies like, you know, Libre or Dexcom, and then some of the members of the type 1 community accepting those sponsorships and promoting it. So we all know the Nick Jonas Dexcom time and range ad. So we were wondering about that, can this thing and advocacy coexist together, or is it creating a barrier to advocacy and it's creating a split in the community? So we tried to discuss that, and we were discussing about, how it's creating actually a split in the community, because on one hand, you have a few privileged who are, basically accepting the money and then, saying whatever they want to. And on the other hand, there's large number of majority who are not able to access that. And we were wondering if that's creating a barrier to the collective action, which is much needed. And I think that's the only way, to achieve our goal for Insulin for All. So we were talking about that. We left our conversation on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a feature that's common but particularly pronounced. It feels like in some of the insulin work and the community, in terms of, it's a big diverse group of folks who are advocating for these issues, and they don't all necessarily have the same goals and values, right? And so if they're advocating for coverage, or if they're advocating for a specific product, then that creates huge issues. And yeah, I completely agree with Matt. Based on the two sentences I read, yes, this has always been a tactic that those in power have used. If there's if I know folks feel pretty strongly about, the Jonases and their type 1 advocacy, but imagine if they hadn't, imagine a separate world, right? Imagine a different world in which they were not co-opted like that. Like that would have been a powerful statement, right? That would have been a huge thing for the type 1 community. Instead, it's more checkered and more complicated. And so it's certainly a problem for when we think about insulin for all, like what does it actually mean and for whom? Stephanie, I see your hand up.
Thanks for me.
There we go.
There we go. All right, thank you. So in our group, I was with Jen and John, and I think we honestly had more questions than answers. We talked about, how do we make a cohesive community, and how sometimes it's difficult to do so because you don't all agree in what the best course of action is. John made a really good point about sometimes it's easier to punch out rather than to punch up. So when you have disagreements in your community, it's easier to vent them to the people closest to you rather than the people in power that we're really trying to unseat. And we left off on how do we get the wider community involved in Insulin for All? How do we convince people that everybody can be a hero? And
those are all excellent points. Liz, feel free to jump in if you have thoughts to add. I would just say that it's good that there are lots of questions. Part of the, I think, intention for this little workshop session was for us to all just kind of take a step back, right, and think about, like, in so much of the work that we do, we are so caught up in kind of day-to-day tactics or strategy, but how does this connect to kind of the bigger world we want to see? And it is quite complicated. And one other reaction I had was, I've been meaning to get to this book. I still have not read this book, but what I've heard, it's an excellent book it's a new history of ACT UP that's by Sarah Schulman, I think. One of the things that my friend was telling me about this book, which I cannot say that I've read, but he was saying that it's an interesting idea that we have in activism, that it's okay. Disagreement is okay. Disagreement is okay. And it doesn't have to be necessarily the case that all the members of a very big, diverse community have to agree on every single thing. And it really depends on the composition of the group, but you could actually have quite a bit of disagreement, and you can have sort of, little semi-autonomous units within the group still acting cohesively, even if they're not acting uniformly. And so, it's obviously a frustration to many of us that we cannot convince others to see the world exactly how we see it and what we think is the right way to move forward. But that doesn't necessarily have to mean that things can't be impactful in a big way.
Totally agree with that. And I think, yeah, the questions will probably always be there, but I think just talking about this and like naming that it's there, and just like you said, saying like the creating what we've been talking about actually with our work with Colibri as a team, is like creating spaces for dissent, and that's okay, and that like we don't need to be afraid of that, and that can often make movements stronger by what one person's pushing from one tactic and another person's pushing from another tactic. I know if you're building, you know, say a local chapter and you have a limited number of voices, I mean, that can take different shapes and different forms and different contexts. But I think, yeah, just like holding that space for that. And even if it feels like it takes a bit more time up front, it's probably going to make your group and your community stronger. Any other questions? I think we actually probably timing wise need to move on to the next question. So we'll keep building on this with the next one, which I'm just going to pop on the screen again. And just again, to kind of context forming when we're talking about kind of avoiding being too focused on heroes, a great book called Unapologetic by Charlene Carruthers has some really useful stuff about movement building. I highly recommend it, but she says lone wolves in movement work can move fast, but can only advance transformative change as far as they're connected with people. So just kind of reiterating some of the things that we've already said. Those people and those connections might be messy, but they're so important. So next question, this is the second and last question of this session. How can we uplift lesser heard voices and perspectives in the movement, especially in terms of historically excluded communities and those unsung heroes? So some of those, again, behind the scenes, people that aren't in the media, people that aren't the most visible. What can we do to help uplift and maybe bring more of those folks in? So we'll hop into breakout rooms now. Welcome back. Who would like to share any nuggets from your conversations that you just had?
All right, I think I'm unmuted now. So we were just saying that essentially going into just being supportive, like for myself, I was mentioning that being a person of color, when we're in this space, there's not very many, just being open to repeat myself and share my story and like kind of hold space for people who are like, okay, she's gone through this, she looks like me, I can maybe talk to her, or I can, because she's done that, I can also potentially share my story also. I think that's just one of those things where we're all kind of different. We all have these aspects of ourselves that someone is going to be interested in. We all have, like for me, I'm a storyteller. So just being able to share that story over and over and over again. Well, I work with children, so I have to repeat myself constantly anyway. So I think that's super important to be able to do. And I also had mentioned, Renee had said, don't you get tired? Because I did say that when there's a moment to advocate, I don't turn off, which I feel like it's kind of energizes me when I see like in the diabetic in the wild and be able to be like, and they're asking my daughter questions and we're able to facilitate conversation. And I think that's just super important to be able to just hold space for people by being who you are.
Yeah, that's so important, and just really appreciate your willingness to sort of repeat for that new person or somebody who needs to hear it again. That's huge.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And I think also it's so interesting, right? Like, depending on which spaces you're kind of present at, I've also found that like, even when you're advocating, right? Or even when you're speaking to people in the media, like these are not the most diverse institutions in the world. And so even when you're making the case, even when you're talking to other folks, it's like, it's it's constantly seeing that, which I think as, you know, even for me, it kind of is frustrating sometimes. But I think very important to highlight that we all, you know, in some ways we are united by a single cause, but in other ways we are so different. And it's so important to reflect the kind of, we have similar identities, but also unique identities. And so we have to kind of be able to both navigate that, but then also in some cases celebrate that, but also it can be a powerful tool for advocacy, frankly, as well, because some folks can talk to other folks in a much better way, in a more meaningful way than others might. And so there are strengths that we can draw upon as well.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Tracy. We're gonna give Chelsea the floor. We're short on time. I feel like we could talk about this for a very long time. So if you can be brief and share, that would be fantastic. Thank you, Chelsea.
Just echoing what we were discussing in our small group, how we want to amplify those melanated voices. And given the pandemic is not going to end anytime soon, you know, I really want to use my platforms to keep spreading those hard truths. And a lot of people don't want to hear it, but I'm putting it out there like almost every day. If not, I'm putting other people's stories in literally, you know, Instagram stories or Twitter. And I want to try to dedicate a little bit more time to my website and creating a page for those BIPOC communities or Black, Indigenous people of color with diabetes. And I want to talk about racism in the diabetes community because it's there, it's been there. And now it's just really becoming more evident from what I've experienced firsthand on social media. So I think really sharing each other's stories, especially those who don't have those kind of platforms or that kind of reach in the diabetes community, is super important. And re-emphasizing the mission of T1I, especially to those platforms, those influencers who have massive followings. We were saying in a small group how we'd like to see them talk about the insulin crisis, not just what you're wearing today or your favorite diabetes accessories. And I'll admit, I've got a couple brands that I'm affiliated with. They don't pay me for my posts, but I get, you know, free stuff from them. Kind of over that part. But it's important we share all aspects, but really now driving the force to battle the crisis that we're all facing. We're facing multiple crises. So it's important everybody shares that with each other.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I know we're running a little bit short on time, so I would kind of wrap my response to your statement in a conclusion as well, which would be that, you know, I think it's all about relationships, right? In a sense, what we are fighting for is actually a different way for governments to relate to pharmaceutical corporations. What we're fighting for is a different way of holding power to account. And in a sense, we see some of these dynamics, we see some of these issues actually crop up even within the kind of new movements that we want to kind of you know, generate and be a part of and mobilize. And so it's really important, I think, that the kinds of things, the kinds of dynamics that we want to see established in the better world that we are fighting for, it's really important that the movements that get us to those better world also have those dynamics. Because it's not enough to say, okay, we'll win and then we'll get better. You know, we'll win and then we'll figure out all these flaws. I think it's kind of, you know, we learn and we grow and we tap into people power wherever it may be. And that's how we take on, you know, some of the most powerful industries in the world and hopefully make insulin for all a reality for everyone.
Yes, thank you both so much. Last little screen share, I promise. Really, really good to start this conversation. It's the start of a continuation of an ongoing conversation. And Ella Baker, one of my idols, so organizing idols, did a lot of that work behind the scenes. She said that there's a danger in our culture that because a person is called upon to give public statements and is acclaimed by the establishment, such a person gets to the point of believing that he is the movement, he or she is the movement, they are the movement. And I think while what we've just talked about in part, I think, is representation. If somebody doesn't see themselves represented, it's going to be harder for them to join into the movement. And so that's hugely important that we work on that now and not later, as Zain said. But equally, when you are that hero in the spotlight, you have, I think, a obligation to bring others in, to pass the mic, as I always like to say, to others who represent someone and something different than you. And we're continuing to try to do that work, and we're not doing it perfectly at T1 International, but it's certainly important to us in this movement that there's not one face, one person. It truly is, seeing this group of people today together, anytime that we come together, it's that's what gets me excited, is each of us have a role to play in this movement, and we're playing it, and we're gonna win this fight. So on that note, again, I think this was an event that Zain attended, and this was our 2019 vigil, and we are, as a collective, not here as a united community, is what will be Big Pharma, is our headline for the day and for the end of this session here. And just want to thank you all again for engaging in the conversation. And Zain, can't thank you enough for being here and being a part of it.
Of course, thanks for the invite.